Starmer this morning, the Labour leader, lists a series of what he calls serious mistakes, and I'm joined now here in the studio by the Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Rachel Reeves, a key part of the Labour team working on coronavirus. Welcome, Rachel Reeves.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can I ask, first of all, about this grim statistic of deaths? 20,000, a big moment when we've passed that. But there's also a growing feeling there are many, many more deaths than that happening in the community, and particularly in care homes.
Yes, in care homes, in hospices and in our homes. And if those numbers were included in the daily reporting, then we would have reached that 20,000 figure many days before now. And I think there's a real problem here, because if somebody who you love and care for dies, it doesn't matter whether that is in a hospital or in a care home or at home. It has the same devastating impact on you and your family. And yet the numbers are being counted in a different way. And I would urge the government to count the deaths in care homes in the same way that they're counted in hospitals on a daily basis, because then we can make sure that we really do know what's happening on the ground, but also we can put the support in to protect the carers in care homes who are often reporting they don't have the personal protective equipment and clothing that they need, and get the testing into the care homes where there's still a real problem with that.
Are you concerned that because early on in this process people were in hospital, and to relieve pressure on the NHS were then sent out of hospital back to care homes without being tested, we might unwittingly have been sending the virus straight into the homes where people are most vulnerable?
That, of course, is a concern, and it is a concern that people working in the care homes are reporting. And Keir Starmer mentioned it at Prime Minister's questions this week, that you've got care home staff who are saying that they're terrified about the situation that they're confronted with, that they're having to do their job. By the nature of the work, you have to be quite close and intimate with the people you are caring for, and yet they're not properly equipped to do their job. And again, we are urging the government to ensure. We ask a lot for those who serve on the front line, and we owe it to them to ensure that they're properly protected in the workplace with that equipment and clothing.
You've been very critical about the government over the level of testing. What number of tests do you think is necessary in the community every day?
Well, the government have committed to 100,000 a day by Thursday this week.
Is that enough?
Well, if we are to come out, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, if we are to come out of the lockdown in the weeks and the months ahead, that level of testing needs to be ramped up further. And we know that there is a huge demand now for the testing. Yesterday, within 15 minutes, the slots for home testing ran out, and within an hour, the appointments for testing at those drive-through centres ran out.
So I ask again, how many tests do you think need to be done every day in this country? And also, how are you going to do it? Because the government's not trying to test, it's doing its best, it's trying to find the kit, it's trying to ramp up and all the rest of it, recruit the people. This is very, very difficult. What would Labour do that they're not doing?
Well, the Prime Minister spoke previously about 250,000 tests a day. And certainly, if we're to come out of the lockdown, we know that we're going to need mass testing at a community level, that people can access those tests locally rather than have to travel many miles. And we're urging the government, and Keir Starmer in his letter today has urged the government to work with local authorities to open up, for example, town halls and libraries that at the moment are closed, to have testing in the community, because there are many examples, including in Leeds, where I'm an MP, of people having to travel many, many miles to be able to access the test. If you don't have a car and you've got symptoms of coronavirus, it's impossible to get those tests.
I mean, the trouble is that earlier on in this process, that's not what the experts, the scientists were saying. They were saying testing is a bit of a side issue, it doesn't matter that much. And so it may well be that the advice the government was given was not good.
Well, the World Health Organization said very clearly that the strategy must be test, test, test. And I think that is absolutely right and essential, because we need to know who has this virus so that those people can isolate along with their families. But also, we know that we've got quite high absence rates, and understandably so, in health and social care, because people have the symptoms of the virus and so are therefore self-isolating. If that testing was available in much higher levels, we'd be able to get people back into the workplace to treat and care for the sick and the vulnerable. So it's important for that reason as well.
You're obviously right to quote the WHO, but from Public Health England, Jenny Harris, who I think got the virus herself later, said that contact tracing and testing was on the 26th of March, so quite late in the day, not an appropriate mechanism as we go forward. And Professor Jonathan Van Tam said it was a side issue. You can see why it's been difficult in government to get this right.
Well, we had testing and contact tracing right at the beginning, and then the numbers of cases increased so sharply that was abandoned. But it seems to me that if we are to come out of this lockdown, those sorts of strategies and measures need to be reintroduced, because if we're to come out of the lockdown, it is essential that we know who has the virus so we can isolate them, that we can trace who they've been in contact with so potentially they isolate as well, and that we have support for shielding people, the most vulnerable, and making sure that they get access to the basics, essentials like the food and medicine.
Looking around at the numbers of cars on the roads, at people in parks and on the streets, it's clear that more and more people are beginning to ignore the lockdown. What do you think the government should be doing about that?
Well, actually, I think that the vast majority of people support the lockdown and want to support the government and the national effort of defeating the coronavirus. So
sure, but
I think we should
traffic is the highest
that.
It's been for a month.
And I think it is important that people continue to abide by the rules, because it is only in doing that we will defeat this virus. But we also need, and I think this is an important point, to take people with us on this journey by giving them a greater indication of what comes next. And part of that is keeping up morale, that there is a plan, we know where we're going, because it is important in the weeks and the months ahead, if and when the numbers start falling further, that we can get back to doing some of those things that we were used to previously.
Let's talk a little bit about the way out of this. In terms of non-essential businesses, what would Labour open first, or like to see open first?
Well, if you look at the examples of other countries, whether it's Denmark or Germany, that have already started to reopen schools, for example, for the youngest children or small businesses, or you look at the plans announced in the last couple of days by Belgium, which are pre-announcing plans to go back to the opening of some businesses and schools in May. It seems that is the approach that others are taking, that potentially we should be taking here. We want the government to publish its plans so that we can scrutinise it. We don't want to put forward a rival plan to the government. We want to work with the government in bringing forward a plan and then getting that right.
Keir Starmer has implied, talking about the same thing this morning in the papers, has implied that the government is treating us like children. That's the front page of the Sunday Mirror. Stop treating us like children. Is that how you see things?
I think it is, and I already said this in answer to a previous question, it's incredibly important that the government take people with us on this journey. People have, by and large, stuck by the rules that have been put in place. And because they've done that, I think it's even more important that we communicate with them, treat them like grown-ups and where we're going next. And I think it's also important for two other reasons. First of all, businesses and schools and other organisations need time to plan if they are to reopen. They need to put in place social distancing measures. They need to bring back their workers. They need to reactivate supply chains. But also government needs... Let me just finish this point, because I do think it's important. Government also need to put in a range of measures to ensure that the lifting of the lockdown works. And that includes mass testing at a community level, contact tracing and shielding the most vulnerable.
I just wanted to ask you specifically about schools, since you mentioned them. Do you think it's possible to reopen schools without social distancing in schools?
I think that it is obviously a really tricky one. And what you're seeing in places like Denmark, for example, is that the class sizes have had to be reduced so that you can have a degree of social distancing in schools. Look, for the youngest children, that is going to be near impossible to have that distancing. But if you can reduce the class sizes, if you can have children outside at school as much as possible, I think there are ways to do that. And I think it's important for two or three reasons. First of all, young people are missing out on vital days and weeks and months of their education. The most vulnerable children in particular. I know from talking to people in my local authority, we're really worried about vulnerable children and where they are. But also, if we want parents to get back to work, we need the schools open. One
very quick last question. Do you think there's going to have to be a public inquiry after this into the way the government's handled it?
It's inevitable that there will be a public inquiry after this. So many lessons to be learnt, as well as thinking about what sort of national recovery plan we need for the future.
All right, Rachel Reeves, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning and for coming in. Now, international comparisons of how countries are coping with coronavirus are not simple. How old people are, how closely they live together, cultural differences can all play a big part in how the virus spreads. But among the Western countries, Germany, with an early lockdown and widespread testing, seems to have done better than anybody else. It's recorded 66 deaths per million people compared to the UK on 282 per million. Sweden has not enforced a strict lockdown by other people's standards and has even kept open bars, restaurants and schools, as well as its borders. I've been speaking to Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister Isabella Lovin and first to Andreas Michaelis, Permanent Secretary of the German Foreign Office and, incidentally, Germany's next ambassador to the UK. Why, I asked, does he think Germany is faring better than others?
We could test from the very beginning at relatively high levels. We have now a test capacity reaching 800,000, of which we only perform 450,000 a week. But we were able to test very early on. That is certainly an important aspect in this. And we have to add to this that we suspect that in the initial phase of the crisis, we had a relatively young age group that was affected, so the number of fatalities were lower.
These tests, how important is it that they are for the general population? In other words, are you using these tests to hunt down, identify the virus and then isolate people who've been in contact? Is that fundamentally their purpose?
Well, it's a combination of things, because people can address the authorities and ask to be tested if they feel that is necessary, because either they have symptoms or they feel they have been in touch, in contact with others that may have infected them. So the number of tests that are being carried out is relatively high as I've described it. If we have outbreaks, certainly the authorities go into it and then offer the test capabilities.
Here in Britain, we didn't have the kit to do these tests very early on, and now every country in the world is struggling to get these testing kits, and yet Germany had supplies from the start. How come you were so well supplied?
I would say we were lucky on the one hand, and we probably did the right policy in the past. There's another factor that is probably standing out when you look at Germany. That's the number of ICUs, so the intensive care units that are available in Germany, which is a figure of 40,000, 30,000 of which can be used with ventilators. And this is really a heritage of our health system. It's almost a core factor of the health system, which we developed and which we ran. And a lot of experts were criticizing us for having too much capacity, too much expenditure on it. I think the population, the people in Germany can now say that's an extra capacity they are very happy to have financed in the past.
Now, you also brought the lockdown measures into Germany very early on, for instance, about a week before Britain did. Do you think that has contributed to the lower death rate?
I think at the beginning, we all started from the same point. And if you look at the measures which we apply at the moment, our strategies are not very different, not different between Germany and the UK, and not different here in Europe as far as I can see. So sometimes it's just a matter of luck.
And so to people in Britain who say, actually, our government has not done very well, look at Germany. You'd say that's actually a bit unfair on the British government.
As you know, Andrew, in science, sometimes when you turn around and say, I moved into the wrong direction, that can be a crucial progress in science, whereas in politics, very often that's considered failure. I would wish that in this situation, we were a little bit more level-headed and we're looking at what really delivers concrete progress in defeating ultimately the crisis we try to contain at the moment.
Well, as you say, the next and dangerous stage in all of this is how and when we unlock. Can I ask you how Germany is going about this? Where are you going to unlock first, and how are you going to deal with citizens who don't behave as you'd wish them to?
So pupils are back at school, not all of them. Certain age groups are back. We also, during this week, allowed shops that are not centrally important in terms of supply for the population to open again if they're not larger than 800 square meters. Some other restrictions were eased. I think this is this careful way of moving forward and seeing whether we can still remain below 1 in the reproduction rate, because that is absolutely crucial.
And when it comes to the unlocking, there's been talk in Britain about using a phone app to track people. Are you doing that in Germany?
We are interested to introduce them, but we don't see this happening before March and June, because it has to be fitted into an overall contact tracing concept. And just to give you an idea, we will have to hire, we're in the process of hiring people at the level of the local health authorities, at district level here, that are able to do the contact tracing. And we think a ratio of roughly a team of 5 for 20,000 people is roughly what we have to come up with. That's a huge number. I give you an idea. I think it's about 650 teams only in the case of Bavaria, which is not easy. So the app by itself is an important factor in moving into that phase, but it has to be complemented by other measures as well.
Andreas Michaelis, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I'm joined now by Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister, Isabella Lovin. Deputy Prime Minister, let me start off with a very straightforward question. You've done things differently in Sweden. Why?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if we have a very different path. I mean, we're trying to contain the contagion and limit the spread of the virus. I think that is what every country is trying to do. But we set out from the start realizing that this is not going to be a sprint. This is going to be a marathon. I think it's a great myth that Sweden hasn't really taken very serious steps to try to address this very, very serious pandemic.
Because, to be clear, you've kept schools for under 16-year-olds open in Sweden, you've kept bars and restaurants open, you've kept your borders open, and as a result, perhaps, you've had a much higher death rate than some other neighbouring countries. For instance, your death rate in Sweden is nearly 200 per million. The Scandinavian neighbours, Finland's had 31 per million, Norway about 36 per million. So is there not some fear in Sweden that you might have been too relaxed?
We have really, I think, a big problem with our main strategy that was to protect the elderly and the most vulnerable. And we've had COVID-19 contagion in the elderly homes. And this is something we're learning from. And this is mainly in the Stockholm area. But we see that we are always prepared to take new measures, but we have confined the gathering of people to a maximum of 50 people. There's also a ban on visiting the elderly at the elderly care homes, but it's a mixture of legally bound measures and also very strong recommendations.
Well, Minister, you say quite rightly that this is early in the story and you described it as a marathon and not a sprint. Is your warning to countries like Britain, which have imposed tighter lockdowns, that at the end there'll be some kind of rebellion or eruption, and overall it would have been better to have been more relaxed from the start?
I think every country needs to take its own measures according to its traditions and its system of governance. But I think it's a real fear that if you have too harsh measures, then they can't be sustained over time and you can get a counter reaction and people will not respect the voluntary recommendations that will need to be respected for a very long time until we have a vaccine or until we know when this pandemic is going to end. And we don't want to fatigue the population, and it's a fact that the Swedish people, to a very large extent, are very supportive of the strategy that we have chosen. And I must underline that this is not a strategy that has come without any impact on our economy or on people's freedom. On the opposite, there is a lot of unemployment. We have more than 90,000 people that have been unemployed during this 4 or 5 weeks.
How much do you think that Sweden's lower population density and far more single-person households, cultural differences as well, have made a difference?
I think it makes it easier for us than in many other countries where maybe you don't have the level of wealth and welfare that we have in Sweden to follow the advice of the authorities to say that you should isolate yourself. In Sweden, you have the possibility to do that, and of course that is a huge privilege for us. And of course, in developing countries, it must be totally impossible for a person to isolate themselves at home if you're living in an intergenerational family and very closely, and maybe you have a very poor situation.
Anders Tegnell, who's your country's chief epidemiologist, has said that Stockholm is quite close to achieving herd immunity and that all of Sweden might follow with herd immunity. Is herd immunity part of your thinking? Is that part of the strategy?
Look, that is not the strategy to achieve herd immunity. The strategy is to try to confine the spread of the virus and limit the deaths and the diseases in the population. And we don't know, the experts tell us that they don't even know about 100% when immunity is reached in one individual person.
And finally, Deputy Prime Minister, you have said that the Swedish population is by and large trusting of its government and is doing what it's told. How important in that has been very transparent, open communication by the government?
I think that's crucial. I think that's absolutely fundamental, that we need to be as transparent as possible, treat people as adults. But, then with that comes also responsibility, an individual responsibility, that you need to listen to what the experts are saying.
Isabella Lovin, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Fascinating to talk to you.
Thank you.
Well, as we heard there, mobile phone apps which track the movements of people reporting symptoms and then the people they've been in contact with may well be a crucial part of how we all escape lockdown. But this is an incredibly difficult and complicated thing to do successfully. Professor Christophe Fraser is the Oxford epidemiologist working on the government and the NHS app and knows how this app is going to work. And I spoke to him a little earlier. I asked him first how many people he thinks in this country have had coronavirus so far.
Well, so there's uncertainty around this, but I would say nationally somewhere between sort of 3 and maybe up to 10% of the population would have had coronavirus by this stage, based on, we're still waiting for the definitive studies based on immunological assays, but this is based on our understanding of the spread of coronavirus.
So several million people up to 6 million people, that kind of figure.
That kind of figure, probably
right.
A bit less.
When it comes to this app, how many people are going to have to use the app for it to work?
Well, I think the app can work, independent of how many people use it. But I think in order to encourage people to use it, we need to explain what the app is for and why this was developed as a public health strategy. So the problem that the app addresses is the transmission of this virus, of the COVID virus, is that about 50% of transmissions occur before symptoms. So it's a very rapidly transmitted virus, and some people have very mild infections. So the issue is that contact tracing is about identifying people who are at risk of transmitting the virus. And the traditional way of doing it, which takes several days, which we were modeling at the start, just isn't quick enough, to get the message to people that empowers people to not go on and spread the virus. So the app is solving, a specific problem, which is how do you get the message that you're at risk and empower you to take measures to protect, your friends, your family, your colleagues, and the people you've been in contact with to help prevent the spread of the virus.
But for it to work in the population, lots and lots and lots of us are going to have to download it on our phones and go out with it. I ask again, roughly speaking, what kind of percentage are going to have to be using this app for it to really crack the virus?
Well, so the app is going to be one of the building blocks of how to get out of the epidemic. And we have sort of two estimates. We found that when we projected over the next 3 months, for every 1 to 2 users who download the app and who adhere to the instructions, you'll prevent 1 infection. And we found that for this intervention alone to stop resurgence of the epidemic, about 60% of the population would have to use the app. Now, that number may be a bit smaller if there are other interventions going on, which we hope there will be: social distancing, large community testing, and indeed manual contact tracing.
As well. But that's about 80%, I think, of modern smartphone users would have to download it. Once it's downloaded and I go out, I've got it on my phone, I go out, what happens if I get an alert saying you have been near somebody with COVID-19? What happens next?
So the intervention is part of a public health intervention. So there would have been messaging that this is part of a test and tracing campaign. So the notification will take place, in a context where there's a lot of description as to what's going on. And we've been modeling different configurations. So what happens next is you'll either get a message which says you've been in contact with a suspect case of COVID, if we're trying to get the message across as quickly as possible, and that's what we found is has the most impact on the epidemic. Or you may later get a message saying you've been in contact of a confirmed case. Now, at that point, we would recommend a degree of isolation, of increased social distancing, and in the case of being a contact of a confirmed case, quarantine for a number of days, sort of 14 days after the contact has taken place.
And just a technical thing, do I have to keep the app working on my phone all the time I'm out?
No. So the app will work in the background. You need to enable the low energy Bluetooth. So the way it works is, when you install the app, this is an opt-in system. So you have to enable the app, and then it will work in the background. Obviously, you have to have your phone with you, and your phone builds up a memory of the sort of anonymous IDs of the other phones you come into contact with. And it needs to be a contact which is going to be long enough that there's a risk of transmission. Right. And then when you're sick, when you're diagnosed, you'll be asked to anonymously notify those contacts. And this is another strength of the system, that the people who you might have been sitting next to on a bus, who you wouldn't be able to recall otherwise, will receive an anonymous notification that they've been in contact with somebody who's either a suspect or a confirmed case of COVID.
So this uses Bluetooth, phone to phone. So if I'm sitting beside somebody on a bus or I pass them in a street, that's fairly straightforward. What about a wall between us? What happens if my neighbour has got COVID-19 and I'm standing a couple of yards away but on the other side of a wall? Is the app able to distinguish between those two situations?
So low energy Bluetooth, this is low energy Bluetooth. So it has, over an extended period of time, we wouldn't measure the signal strength over a single ping, but the app is being validated by engineers in multiple countries, including extensive validation in the UK, to precisely answer those questions and to make sure that it's the contacts which are, the most likely to result in transmission, which are recorded.
I guess where all of this is leading, Professor, is to the question of security and privacy, because for different reasons there are lots of people who don't necessarily want other people to know exactly where they are all the time. How sure can people be that the information is used only for its primary purpose and is entirely secure within the NHS app?
Well, so NHS, the NHS records patient data already, and we trust the NHS to look after private data, and this is being developed transparency with NHS has engaged experts in privacy, and the people need to remember that this is being designed with a relatively minimal amount of data, as much data as is needed to make it work, and it's a public health intervention. Sure. with data collected within a health system.
Talking about the NHS, there are lots and lots of NHS workers who are in direct contact with people with COVID-19 every day and hour of their working lives. Presumably the app doesn't really work for them.
Well, so indeed, and a configuration is being developed for healthcare workers. It's nonetheless important that healthcare workers, if they become infected, will also want or should be empowered for that information to be passed on, to their friends and colleagues in the community. But indeed, we need to account and are accounting for those contacts in hospitals.
This is a really complicated and difficult thing you're doing. How long do you think it is before the technology will be there and enough people will have downloaded an app for this to get going?
The aim is to develop to release this within weeks, but as soon as, like all of these things, as soon as all of the testing and all of the engineering and all of the modelling and all of the policy review and the behavioural review and the ethics review and the engagement has been done.
Finally, do you think if we had pursued this policy earlier on, lives would have been saved?
I think so. I worked on the SARS epidemic in 2003, and testing and tracing is really a cornerstone of how you stop a serious infection. And I do think that strategy, scaled up, is tremendously effective.
Well, Professor Fraser, you've been very generous with your time. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And that was Professor Fraser, who's been advising on that contact tracing app. Now then, the governments of Wales and Scotland have told their citizens more than London has about how they're thinking about beginning to ease the lockdown. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has called for an adult conversation about this, and she joins me now from Glasgow. Nicola Sturgeon, welcome to you. You've been pretty measured about the London government's handling of the crisis so far, but one of your MPs, Stuart Hosey, has been much less measured, and the SNP put out his comments in a press release this week. He said that the government's response had been botched, shambolic, too slow, too late, too chaotic, must get its act together. Is that basically your view as well?
Look, I understand, because I'm First Minister leading a government, how difficult and how unprecedented this situation is. We're all trying to make the best decisions we can, undoubtedly getting things wrong along the way, as every government across the world will be. And I've been very clear about that from the outset. I'll make mistakes. Everybody involved in leading these responses will make mistakes. But it's really important we take the best decisions we can at every single stage and try to learn from that as we go. I mean, certainly right now, the measures that are in place are having an effect in suppressing this virus. We see that in the data we publish every day, hospital admissions and intensive care admissions. But it's too early right now to have any confidence that we could lift any of these measures without seeing the virus potentially run out of control again. And I think, firstly, it's important to be honest about that. It's also important to be frank that, at the end of this 3-week period, there's no guarantee that any of these measures can be lifted. But as we do start to ease them, it's not a flick of the switch moment. There will be a real need for care and caution in a very slow and gradual process. And I think the more we can have that conversation in a very open and frank way, recognising the uncertainties and the difficulties of the path ahead, then the more likely we are to take the public with us as we take these difficult decisions.
Well, let's try and have that open and frank conversation, Nicola Sturgeon. I'm not going to hold you to anything, nor do I expect you to make policy on the hoof. But, for instance, you've talked about reopening schools. Now, if social distancing is going to be applied to schools, then clearly far fewer pupils can be in each classroom than normal. Do you think we're going to see kids going to schools, maybe some of them only on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, others on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, or perhaps only some in the morning and others in the afternoon? How do you think it's going to work, or could work?
So in general terms, yes, I think arrangements like that may well be what we have to put in place to allow children to start going back to school. Now, again, just let me be very clear, it would not be right or safe to open schools right now, and that may continue to be the case for some time to come. But the point I think everybody is trying to get their head round right now is that as we come out of these very restrictive measures, we're not going to be going back to normality as we knew it. It's what I described and many others have have used this phrase, a new normal that we're looking for, where social distancing will be a fact of life for quite some time to come, and different ways of operating will have to be contemplated. So I've said over the course of the last few days that arrangements just like the ones you've set out there, in whatever form we decide is best there, may well be how we get schools to slowly and in a very phased way come back into operation. Right. And what we need to do as we look at measures like that, but also other areas where how we get businesses to open up again, we've got to be very clear that we measure and model and try to predict the impact of all of these things. Right now, what we're trying to do, and having some success, although we can't be confident that we've succeeded enough, is driving the number of cases down to as low a level as possible, and crucially keeping that reproduction rate as far under 1 as we can. Now, we think we're making progress with that, but we need more data to be confident. And then some of the margins we will be faced with as we start to ease things are very, very fine indeed. So there will be a need for real care and caution, and perhaps on some instances to go back again if we find that things that we have done have allowed the virus to run out of control.
Well, let me ask you about something that I think people up and down the country are thinking about, which is grandparents and parents. If they'll forgive me, my parents are not in their absolutely first flush, living outside Dundee. When do you think it's likely that I will be able to go and see my parents?
Look, I'm not going to give you a date for that now, Andrew, because it would be irresponsible for me to do so, because I don't yet have the information that gives me the confidence that I can say that with certainty. What I would say is that, you know, one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult aspect of all of this is that need for grandparents to be separated from their grandkids. My own parents are suffering from that right now. You know, grandparents up and down the country are in the same position. Now, it's really tough, and nobody wants that to be the case for longer than necessary. And this is also a tough thing to say. This is about the protection of older people who we know are much more vulnerable to becoming ill and dying from this virus than other age groups. And I guess it's to try to make sure that grandparents are around for longer to see their grandkids grow up. But it illustrates very, very well just how incredibly difficult all of this is, which means these decisions, you know, don't get easier as we move on. No. They actually get tougher, because we may go from a position that we're in right now and need to continue to be in for a period to come of saying to everybody, stay at home, isolate in certain circumstances, to messages that might be a bit more nuanced, which makes the communication of them even more difficult. And that's why, again, I think it's so important that politicians try to share as much of this thinking and as much of the uncertainty as we can.
One area of uncertainty is who you'll be able to socially mix with in the going. You've used the word a bubble of people. How many people do you think will be in that bubble? How many other people will we be able to have a conversation in person with?
Well, again, I don't know the answer to that right now. This is very strange territory for politicians to say, I don't know. But these are the kind of things that we're looking at. So, for example, we're all in a sense right now being told to stay within our own household bubble. So the advice is clear right now, and this remains the advice, don't mix outside your own household. One of the things, and some other countries have been doing this as well, is could that definition of a household be slightly extended so that you could mix with maybe 1 or 2 other people outside it, as long as they were the only ones you were mixing with and you were the only people they were mixing with. So I'm using these examples to illustrate the kind of work that we're all starting to do. And as soon as we published a quite high-level document on Thursday, over the days and weeks to come, we want to translate that and evolve that into something with harder answers to these questions attached to it. So we've got more detail with timescales and milestones attached.
It does look as if Scotland might exit the lockdown in a slightly different way, with different regulations or rules than England. In those circumstances, I know that you like questions about borders. Do you have the power to close the border if you need to?
I don't have the power to close borders, but these are discussions, of course, we want to continue to have with the UK government. And on this question of will Scotland do things differently, not for the sake of it, we won't, only if the evidence and our judgment tells us that that is necessary. Now, that would mean if, and it is an if, I'm not saying that we're likely to get into this territory, if the UK government took decisions that I thought were premature in terms of coming out of the lockdown, then clearly I would want to make sure that Scotland did what I judged was best to protect the population. But the virus doesn't respect borders or boundaries, and people travel freely across different parts of the UK, and that's why I think it has been important, as well as for the simplicity of messages, to have as much consistency across the UK as possible. And I think that's still the starting point, but we all have to take decisions that we judge to be right. It's not political in any way, shape or form.
All right, let me talk to you about testing, because originally you said you were going to have 10,000 tests a day by the end of April. Then you downgraded that to 3,500 tests, and you're still below 2,000 tests. Testing is not going well in Scotland, is it?
Well, I don't think you're factually correct in the first part of that. 3,500 capacity for tests by the end of April was what we said. Then when the UK government set its 100,000, we said we would seek to make sure that anything they were doing proportionately applied to Scotland as well. We are absolutely on track, not just to meet that capacity, but probably exceed it by the end of April. The challenge now, and progress has been made on this every day, is to make sure that that capacity is being fully utilised. So we had 3 objectives for testing at the outset. We're expanding some of those categories and looking to see how we go beyond that even further. So, for example, working care homes, expanding to different groups of key workers. So that is ongoing. Plus, we're increasingly, as all governments are, looking to how we go to a much more expanded system for a test, trace, isolate approach in the next phase.
Right, you mentioned care homes there. 1/3 of Scottish deaths have been in care homes in Scotland. That's a lot more than in England and Wales. Why?
Well, look, I don't know what the England and Wales figures are entirely based on. Okay, but I'm not. I think it's for others to suggest. I've read comments that suggest that perhaps there is an underestimate in the rest of the UK, but I can't say that for sure. What I do know is that if you look at the emerging evidence from other countries, and there's been some work published on this in recent days, then in many other countries the percentage of deaths in care homes are much more in line with what the figures in Scotland are showing. In fact, even higher. Some countries it would be 40 to 50%. Now, Scotland's data that we are publishing, we're publishing data that is more up to date than other parts of the UK, and I think more granular in many respects. But we're also, more importantly, taking a whole host of actions to try to prevent and control infections in care homes.
Let me read you one other explanation which came from the GMB Scotland Union, reported in the Scotsman newspaper on Thursday. They said social care workers had to wait until 5 weeks after the first COVID-19 infection in Scotland to receive clear and unambiguous guidelines on PPE, and many still do not have the proper PPE to do their job safely. More than 2 months after the first infection, there is still no robust testing programme for workers to help mitigate virus spread, sustain services and save lives. I say to you again, something is going wrong.
Look, I would challenge some of that, although we talk to the GMB and others on an ongoing basis, because I believe the responsibility on me and government is to respond to any concerns and try to address them along the way, which is what we have been doing. There's been clear guidance in place for the management of infection in care homes for some time now. And remember, care home providers are in the prime position here to make sure that they're protecting their staff and their residents with the support of government. We've been working to make sure not only that we have the supplies of PPE, but they're getting to where they're needed. We've put new supply distribution routes in place. We now have been delivering PPE direct to care homes as well as through local hubs. So this is work that is evolving on an ongoing basis, because the responsibility to make sure health and care workers are protected is one of the most important that any government bears right now.
All right, Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much for getting up to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, until the great unlocking happens, we have to use the time as best we can. For many parents of children and others, that means learning new things. The BBC's doing its bit with BBC Bite Size, using some distinguished figures, including David Attenborough, to teach children at home. Another of the expert teachers is Professor Brian Cox, the physicist famous on television and now one of the faces of Bite Size. I spoke to him just before the show came on air, where he's doing lockdown at home and teaching his own 10-year-old son. And I asked him to tell me about Bite Size.
Well, I think the easiest way is if you go online to a search engine, type BBC Bite Size, then you'll come up to the web page with links to all the lessons. But if you can't do that, they're also available on the red button on the TV.
Now, there's 200 of the UK's top teachers, plus very famous faces like yourself, doing this. What kind of things are you going to be teaching?
Well, I was asked to do two things, which turned out to be quite difficult, actually. One is to talk about forces and motion, how things move, but for 10 and 11-year-olds. And then also for 11 and 12-year-olds, talk about the solar system, astronomy in general. I should say that these are all subjects that are on the curriculum at the various different key stages. And so the whole thing is built around what those students, those children would be learning in school were they at school now.
You've got your own 10-year-old, I think, in the house at the moment, and you're homeschooling him. How's that going?
Well, I must say, as I said, it was quite difficult because these concepts, I mean, we're talking about motion, for example. It sounds like something obvious. You know, you just say, well, things move, and if you apply a force, they accelerate. But actually thinking about these things ultimately led Einstein to his theories of relativity in 1905 and 1915. So understanding how to pitch these ideas to these age groups, particularly 10, is a real challenge. And I must say, just as an aside, it gave me, if I needed to have any more respect for the skill and professionalism of teachers, and I'm sure many parents share this view, then it has been delivered to me very harshly, in some sense, by trying to take over, however briefly, and to explain these very complicated concepts.
Yeah, not so easy. And presumably, lots and lots of people have the experience as younger people of being taught science at school and finding it a bit dry. How do you get round that problem? Because it is crunchy. You do need to know lots of facts. It's a bit mathematical. How do you deal with children?
Well, I mean, to give you one example, I mean, I was talking about the solar system and galaxies. So one of the questions that they're posed in the curriculum is what's the Milky Way made of? Now, that sounds like a very simple question. You might say stars. Yeah. Well, it turns out, in fact, that only around 5% or so of the mass of a galaxy like the Milky Way is in the stars, in the matter we can see. By the way, that's 200 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Most of it's made of something called dark matter. We don't know what that is. And in that sentence, I think, is the key to inspiration. The great Richard Feynman, in an essay called The Value of Science, back in 1955, said, what's the most valuable thing about science? It's teaching us to embrace doubt and uncertainty. That idea that there's something profound about the galaxy, in this case, what this mysterious substance dark matter is that makes up most of it. There's something profound that we don't know, is not to be feared. It's to be welcomed and embraced. And to me, just my experience with my son is that's the kind of thing that captures his imagination. And I would go on to say, actually, that what Feynman was saying is that the reason that we teach science, the value of science, is probably that one concept. And you'll see it. You know, I know this is a primarily political show. You'll be talking about the current situation we're in. The point is that we are facing the unknown. This is a new virus that appeared just late last year or early this year. We don't know much about it.
Right.
And so that idea that what we have to do as a society is to find out. But when you hear we're following the science, right?
Yeah.
That following the science means understanding that we don't have the answers yet.
Well, we're all following the science. Some of us are trailing further behind than others. But the coronavirus crisis has given lots and lots of people a new respect, obviously, for scientists of all kinds. Do you think it's going to see a great uptick in kids wanting to know about science? That will be one of the, as it were, virtuous results of this dreadful time.
I think so. I mean, ultimately, I think this crisis will be solved by science in the sense that we need a vaccine and or effective treatments. And so I think that when you see science in action, as I said, there's no such thing as the science, which is a key lesson. If you hear a politician say we're following the science, then what that means is they don't really understand what science is. There isn't such a thing as the science. Science is a mindset. It's about trying to understand nature, and that can be a rather painfully slow and frustrating process, as we see here. But it's also, in that sense, an exciting process if this is the key point, if you embrace the idea that doubt is, to, as Feynman said, is to be welcomed and not feared.
Well, I guess there is nobody in the country anymore, not a single person, asking what's the point of science. Brian Cox, thanks very much indeed for talking to us, and good luck with Bite Size.
Thank you very much.
We're told Boris Johnson returns tomorrow to number 10. I'm joined now by the man who's been deputising for him and running the government while he recovers, the Foreign Secretary and First Secretary of State, Dominic Raab. Welcome, Mr. Raab.
Good morning.
A grim moment, 20,000 deaths, but it's a lot more than that, isn't it?
Oh, it's heartbreaking to pass that threshold. Grim overall, but also you think of all the loved ones left behind, and that, one success though we have had, if you look at the measures we've taken, the timing of them, is that we are starting to see the flattening of the peak. So it sounds difficult to say, but that death toll could have been much worse if we hadn't have taken the social distancing measures, and crucially if the public hadn't have really backed them in the way they did. And secondly, we've kept our critical care capacity in the NHS. We've preserved it with the V beds, the ventilator beds, the critical care beds, and that has also meant that as we go through the peak, the NHS has been able to cope not just with coronavirus patients, but other urgent treatments too.
I'm just sticking with the numbers for a moment, though. It looks as if the 20,000 figure, which is for deaths in hospital, there's about the same number of deaths out of hospital in the community and in care homes and elsewhere. Is that, roughly speaking, what you think?
Well, we don't know for sure. We've always said that it's more difficult outside of hospitals to measure because in care homes you've got lots of elderly people, sometimes with multiple conditions. So what we've done and what the Care Quality Commission is doing with the ONS is looking very carefully at the figures, and they'll release some more later this week. But we've always been clear that the data we publish on NHS hospitals is because it is more reliable. It's also easier to compare internationally.
All right. Now, many of those who've died have, of course, been NHS and care workers themselves. Do they deserve the best protection?
Absolutely, and every one of them, we've seen 78, I think on the latest figures, NHS staff pass away as a result of this, 16 care workers, and that's why we know there's been a challenge with personal protective equipment. We're doing everything we can in an international supply shortage to get them the PPE, the equipment that they need. But it hasn't been easy. We hold our hands up. It hasn't been easy for any country.
Have they had the best kit?
The very best we can get them. As Foreign Secretary...
That's no, isn't it?
No.
They haven't had the best kit, have they?
They've had... Well, in terms of the actual kit that they're distributed with, that depends on NHS leaders and the Chief Medical Officer and Public Health England giving the guidance. That's not done by politicians. But when I speak to foreign ministers and foreign leaders, which I do every day, every country has this challenge. So what we've done, we've delivered 1 billion items of PPE equipment to care homes, to the NHS, elsewhere where it's needed. We've ramped up the domestic supply and procurement with Paul Dayton, who ran the 2012 Olympics, coming in really to put his shoulder to the wheel and grip that. And on the international side of things, from China to the US, everyone, we are making sure we're the international buyer of choice so that where there are opportunities, notwithstanding a massive global shortage, we can secure that PPE and get it to the front line as soon as possible.
You mentioned Public Health England just now, but they said, new guidance they put out on the 17th of this month said some compromise is needed to optimise the supply of PPE in times of shortage. Now, those people applauding the NHS workers don't want compromises to be taken in protective equipment.
Well, those kind of guidance changes and making sure that the resources and the equipment we get to those in the right level of prioritisation is something that the NHS is used to doing, and they are within the WHO guidelines. So nothing has been done which is irresponsible, and quite rightly, Public Health England and the NHS leaders take those decisions.
You say that, but at the same time, we've got lots of reports of NHS people having to reuse gowns, wash and reuse gowns, and indeed nurses. The Federation of Nurses has reported that nurses are being given cagoules instead of gowns. There is still a lot of anxiety on the front line about PPE, even after all of this effort.
Absolutely. And look, I'm going to be honest with you, this has been a challenge. We've got a lot of things right, the social distancing measures, the critical care capacity, but countries around the world have faced this global supply shortage. So the reassurance I can give is not just that we have delivered huge numbers of protective equipment, but there is no stone being left unturned in relation to either domestic production or supply or the international supply. We are the international buyer of PPE of choice for anyone that can, at the right specification, specification, because as you said, the safety of the equipment is important, but also at the scale to get it to the front line where it's needed.
So by when will enough PPE have arrived so that no compromises need to be made in hospitals and in care homes?
Well, it's very difficult to say that with precision and the kind of reliability that you want as a guarantee. What I can say is we're making sure that we've got as much stocks, and also when we've got stocks of PPE, and sometimes we, in certain regions or in certain areas like NHS versus care homes, that we can move it to where it's most needed. The agility of the system, as well as the overall supply, is critically important. We're doing everything we can on that front.
There's still something going wrong at the sort of centre when it comes to this. There's a company called E.O on Merseyside which offered 10 million masks to the Cabinet Office, and then more than a week passed without any kind of answer at all, and they eventually gave up and they sold the masks abroad. And they're not the only company who have found difficulty getting through and getting responses to genuine offers of the essential kit. So something's going wrong at the centre.
Well, look, there's certainly been a huge number of companies offering their services and their supplies, and that's great. We want that. Every one of them should be getting a response. But then, of course, we whittle them down to the ones that can provide the NHS equipment at the spec, the specification, and also the volume that makes it worth proceeding. I know the NHS is looking at well over 1,000 of those suppliers that have come forward. Can I just make one point, though? We have seen countries, and I'm not going to single them out, but European countries who have distributed PPE where it's not at the right specification. Then they've had to not just withdraw it, but the NHS workers in their countries or the health workers in their country have had to go into isolation. So it is really important, and I know it may feel bureaucratic for some companies, that we do the checks.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get it
but
as
with
swiftly.
respect, if you end up with cagoules instead, it's not very effective. I mean, I'm not trying to be silly about this. You've got lots of things right as a government. Clearly, the Nightingale, the ventilator story, in many respects, you've got right. Lots of things have gone well. But would you accept that perhaps PPE has not gone well?
Well, I think we're not in the place on PPE that we'd want to be, but I guess the point I'd make is that there's an international supply shortage and you're dealing with an unprecedented and very deadly virus, and people weren't clear at the outset quite what the full implications all the way down the track would be. Everyone is grappling with this issue. What I can tell you is no country is putting more effort in to making sure people on the front line have got the equipment that they need.
Let's try and sit back and look ahead a little bit if we can.
Sure.
Life is not going to return to normal, is it, anytime soon?
I think we won't just have this binary easing up of measures, if that's what you're talking about. We'll end up moving to, and I heard Nicola Sturgeon use the same language I've used before about moving to a new normal. And I think we will need to make sure that we can proceed in a sure-footed way, which is why I know the temptation to start announcing proposals now, but actually until you've got the evidence, that's not responsible. It risks you ending up misleading. I know you're not going down, but we need to take a sure-footed step forward, which protects life, but also preserves our way of life. So we're very focused on doing the homework that can allow us to do that. But you're absolutely right. For example, the social distancing measures, applying them in different contexts is going to be with us for some time.
So when people are sitting at home and trying to sort of guess or imagine what's coming next, how different is the new normal going to be, as it were, compared to the world in early March that we left behind?
Well, I think it's going to be different in lots of the ways that we're already seeing. So, for example, I went and got on Friday night some milk from the supermarket. Everyone is queuing 2 metres apart. There are all sorts of precautions the businesses have taken. If you think that those are the measures that we've taken for essential businesses that haven't shut down, you can see how in various different ways they could be expanded to non-essential businesses currently closed in other contexts. But it is going to be important that we've got some social distancing measures going forward in all of these areas. And also, if you think about what employers and in those businesses are doing with hand gel, cleaning surfaces and all of those other measures.
Perhaps fewer people in the office near each other, perhaps fewer people sharing screens and mouses and keyboards and pens and coffee cups and all of that.
All of those variables will be important, but you can immediately see why. First of all, as we said when we set out our 5 tests, we need to get the virus down in terms of the death rate and the infection rate. We also need to test what is the responsible thing to do, what doesn't allow the virus to come back, take grip, and lead to a second spike. Not only, can I just make the final point, not only would that be bad for our health as a country and the death toll, but also, as the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey has said, would be bad for the economy. You'd get a protracted lockdown, a second lockdown, and that would damage public confidence. So as I say, there'll be a new normal. Plenty of the things you've described will be part of it, but we do need to make sure the next step we take is a sure-footed one.
Again, not looking for new policy, but just for your reflections. Is it possible for schools to come back without social distancing?
I think it's inconceivable that they would come back without further measures as are already being applied in those schools that are open for key workers, and looking at how that could be done. I'm not going to get drawn on this.
I'm not, but that means, logically, because the schools can't double in size overnight, that the class sizes are going to have to be smaller.
I understand what you're trying to do.
Well, I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just trying to imagine, which means that kids will not go to school every day, or they might go to school for only part of the day. Again, lots of parents and children and teachers are just trying to imagine the kind of options the government will eventually have to make and announce.
But you see, if I start suggesting one or other thing now without us knowing where the virus is and without us testing the package of measures with the scientists, which is the homework that we're doing, we send the wrong signals and we don't provide reassurance. We actually might provide more worry for parents and teachers. But you're certainly right to say, and of course, with schools, as with essential
kind of choices that you're having to talk about inside government and eventually announce, you're going to have to do something like that.
Well, the most important thing is to look at the extent to which schools would be a vehicle for allowing the virus to spread. We know that among children and younger people, it is much less likely to have a dangerous impact on them, but children as a means for spreading the virus between households is something where we need the scientists to give us further evidence. So we'll look at all of those measures, but I'm not going to be drawn on the detail because we might end up changing our mind once we know the fuller evidence.
You might. And again, I'm not asking you for the detail, but there's been reports that, and people are talking about this up and down the country, that we will be allowed 10 friends and family with whom we can socially intercourse, as it were. Is that the kind of thing that the government's thinking about?
Well, I've heard all of those kinds of things. And of course...
That was briefed by the government, by somebody in the government.
And I hear all sorts of things that are apparently briefed by the government, which turn out not to be the case from the meetings that I'm attending. We will look at everything, from businesses and the schools that you've mentioned, where we've got some learning, because we've got social distancing measures in place for essential businesses and for those schools where key workers are still going, right the way through to the open spaces and the wider social interaction. But critically, we've got to make sure two things. First of all, we don't risk a second spike for all the reasons we've discussed. Secondly, that overall this package doesn't allow the coronavirus to get back hold, to spread more widely, and to undo all the progress we've made, and frankly, all the sacrifices so many people have made.
You're a sportsman. There's been a lot of talk about elite sport and football clubs playing games, behind closed doors, as it were, for TV audiences. But again, up and down the country, there are huge numbers of smaller sporting clubs, cricket clubs, local football clubs, tennis clubs, wondering whether there's any chance of sport being played outside in this country during the summer.
Very difficult because of the level and the scale of interaction. I think the professional sport may be different because of the scale of testing that they would be able to introduce, but we will look at that in the round. One thing that is true to say, I think with the lockdown, it's not just been a strain on people physically, economically. I think there is a lot of mental health challenges with that, and anyone with small children will know that. So we do want to look, when it's safe, when it's responsible, at ways to allow more outdoors activities to take place. But again, we've got to have the evidence that that is a sure-footed step and doesn't allow coronavirus to get a grip back on the country.
Sure. And to stop that happening, you mentioned testing just now, but to stop that happening, clearly everyone's watching this 100,000 tests a day target, but it's beyond that, isn't it? Let me read you Matt Hancock on the 3rd of April. We increased the goal for the end of April to 100,000 tests, and then we will go on to meet the target which the Prime Minister has previously set out of 250,000 tests per day. Is that 250,000 tests per day target still the government's aim?
Well, certainly we want to get 100,000 daily tests by the end of the month. We're on track. I can talk about the detail with you of that. But you're absolutely right. That is a milestone. We've got to ramp testing right up. And I don't know whether it was set out as a specific target. I think it is more...
The Prime Minister said that you were going to do it.
Well, we certainly got to get the daily testing right up to hundreds of thousands, which along with the the tracking and the tracing gives us a chance to... What it does, and what's really important about this, gives us more flexibility because we can open up measures, open up access in the way you've described, but monitor very carefully the effects. And that, along with the vaccine and therapeutics, will be the medium and long-term way of dealing with coronavirus sustainably, responsibly, for good.
To track this virus, we have to start to test people without symptoms. When are we going to do that?
So again,
to test people without symptoms. When are we going to be able to test people without symptoms in order to track the virus?
Well, we can test people now with the swab test, but what matters is, of course, look, the changes that we've made at the tail end of last week were really important. We focused our testing capacity on NHS workers. We broadened it to care home workers. Then obviously, I think people understand the immediate priority. Then last week, we've expanded it to all essential workers. And that is, I think, the right set of priorities immediately. But of course, when you look at things like the social distancing measures, the 7 and the 14-day rules, once we've got testing up to the kind of scale, we can look and see whether people are in the households who are in isolation but actually haven't got the virus, whether actually they can go back to work more quickly.
Yes,
but you need to get the testing right up there for that.
There were reports in the papers today about a big breakthrough on the antibody tests and suggestions that the government had already ordered 30 million of those. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure whether we've ordered those. We're certainly looking very carefully at that. The antibody tests, of course, for viewers at home, will make sure that they test for whether someone has previously had the virus. And there's
therefore possibly immune.
Possibly immune. But let's just be clear about this. You've talked about testing and vaccines, really important. And we're pursuing each of those at pace and at scale to make sure that we can deal medium and long term. But the vaccine wouldn't realistically come into play until the end of the year. The testing, tracking and tracing, I think, has a better medium-term prognosis. There's also therapeutics and drugs. And the reason that's important is if we can actually treat coronavirus and take away the fatalities, if it became something more akin to seasonal flu, that would also give us more flexibility in the next transition phase.
But there has been a breakthrough on the antibodies, as far as you're aware.
Well, there's all sorts of progress that's been made. I think we need to make sure in the NHS that it's reliable. I don't think that we're yet sure we've got an antibody test that can be scaled up, which can be safely relied on.
Just looking back, for absolutely obvious and good reasons to protect the NHS, we sent people out of hospitals back into care homes before they were tested. And by doing that, we may have sent the virus straight into the heart of the most vulnerable communities in the country. Do you look back and think that may have been a serious mistake?
I think we're learning lessons all the time, but you're right to say that in the social care plan, the action plan Matt Hancock put out, it's very clear that people have to not just be tested before they're discharged from hospital to go into care homes, but we've revised the guidance so that within care homes, where you have non-COVID residents, but also COVID, people suffering from COVID-19, that the right arrangements are in place.
We only started testing people going back into care homes, I think, about 10 days ago. And it's beginning to look as if what's going on in care homes might be the darkest part of this whole story.
Well, I'm not sure that I'd say it's the darkest, but we've said all along that there is particular vulnerability in care homes. The reason being is you've got large numbers of people over 65 with multiple conditions, and we're waiting for the CQC and the ONS to give us a better handle on the number. But we're also reasonably confident that the deaths in care homes is coming down at about the similar rate to more broadly as captured by the NHS figures. And critically, whether it's the testing, the PPE, the ramping up of the workforce to 20,000. Again, it's not. You sort of suggested that we're kind of not doing enough in those areas. We're doing everything that we reasonably can. The military helping to distribute the tests.
I know hindsight's a wonderful thing and all of that. It's just that there does seem to be a particular problem with taking people with COVID-19 and putting them into care homes and the result of that. But can I ask about something slightly different? There's been a lot of criticism of the government for not testing people and stopping them as they're coming into the country from through airports in particular. Is that going to change?
Well, it might do, but I can't say with any certainty yet. The reason being, the advice that we got, and I checked it with the scientist, the chief medical officer, at the outset when we took our social distancing measures, is it wouldn't make any difference from a public health point of view. The numbers coming down were of people travelling were plummeting, and also the virus was already at pace.
There might be a quarantine period put in for people coming into the country.
Well, whether it's a quarantine period or testing or other measures that might be taken, it's possible. And I ask this question every week. Can we just check that there aren't measures at the border that at the current level of the coronavirus challenge that we face wouldn't make a difference? And we will keep asking that question.
Gloucestershire Live looked at a survey of the hospitals in that area and found the hospital nearest to the Cheltenham racecourse had the highest number of COVID-19 deaths, given how many people were at these mass gatherings at the Cheltenham races. Looking back, again, do you think it was a mistake not to stop those mass gatherings a bit earlier?
Well, we took the scientific advice available to us at the time, and we balanced that very carefully in the round. But look, Andrew, we're learning lessons as we go through this. Every country is. But also, I come back to that point. One, you mentioned the successes the government have had, flattening the peak, making sure the NHS is able to cope. That only happened because we've very deliberately taken the right measures at the right moment in time. So that basic approach, I'm sure and confident looking back, is the right one.
An entirely different story. Is Kim Jong-un dead?
We don't know. I've read the media reports internationally. We haven't got that corroborated yet, but obviously we're following it very carefully.
Boris Johnson is coming back tomorrow. I gather he's in good form. You've been spending quite a lot of time talking to him and meeting him. Yes. Did you enjoy this period running the country? Enjoy is perhaps the wrong word. Did you have some relish to actually be in charge for a while, or are you just simply relieved to be handing it back?
I don't think any of those really does it justice. I mean, look, when your Prime Minister is stricken with the coronavirus, and particularly when we knew it was touch and go, you're thinking very much personally of him, but also the role of leading the government. I also think of the country and the position it's in. And like all of those key workers, like the rest of the country, my job is just to step up to the plate. And I have to say...
And he's going to come back in full force, is he?
Yeah, I was just going to say the whole cabinet and the civil service have really stepped up to the plate because it has been a difficult time. The PM is looking forward to getting back. He's raring to go. I think it will give a boost to the government and a boost to the country.
Dominic Raab, thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us this morning. That's all from me. Thanks to all my guests and above all to you for watching. There's more politics on BBC One after this programme. I will be back, of course, next week. Goodbye.